Hey, welcome to Auror's Digest. One of the things that I love doing is reading about etymology. This is the origin of words, how they develop and how they change over time. So I was interested in how all the neighborhoods in Nairobi were named after. So if we go online, you'll find very interesting things like Kibera was named after Kibra, Nubian word for forest. Dagoretti, controversial about whether it's the Great Corner, I believe, on that, so on and so forth. But I came to realize when I searched Kayole, I couldn't find anything, not a hint, not even a slight description. Like Dandora, it came from the couple Dan and Dora who owned the estate over there. So I started digging. So the first place that I started was to look at how did the estate come up. And if you look at the history of Nairobi, when the eastward expansion of Nairobi started, when Buruburu, Umoja, Kayole, Donholm, and Bakassi was started off, this used to be ranches or land owned by the white settlers. So I started looking there. Well, the first place that I went to, Google Books. Google Books is great for this type of information. So the first thing that I found out, and if you look at this timeline, you have a company which was known as Kayole Sisal Limited, which was registered by an Indian guy known as Arukan Shah. If you don't know about this guy, do you know about the Kifaru matchboxes? Yes, that's the same family that owned the land that was currently known as Kayole. So I started stepping back in time looking at what is the earliest mention on Google Books on Kayole. So over this timeline for this company, the first mention was in 1952, where Kayole Sisal Limited was incorporated into Kenya. But then that means that was the place already known as Kayole, or it had another name. So I kept on digging, and I found this book in 1947. They mentioned about a Catholic church that was set up in Kayole, which means that area by 1947 was already known as Kayole. And then I got stuck. And then I got a lucky break. So I found an Ugandan guy known as A.D. Kayole who was writing about the Buganda kingdom and the wars that were fighting during that time. And then it clicked in my mind, does Kayole have anything to do with Uganda? And then voila, I found some very interesting stuff on this. So Kayole from the Luganda language actually means a heap of grass or a bunch of grass. And how it came about was the Ugandan kingdom, if you know about the whole setup about the Baganda, was that the royal house used to be well thatched. And you can look at this image that is well thatched, and you have someone whose work is to ensure that everything went very well. And there was a particular sub-clan whose job was specifically to provide laborers to make those thatched houses. So every time a house was completed, the Kabaka would walk around inspecting it, and then he would say a word, Wabula Kayole. I hope I'm spelling it right. So what that translates into Luganda was like, it's missing a bunch of grass here for that. Then it became a phrase. And so every person who used to work on the royal house or the roofing was known as Wabula Kayole. And then they shortened it to Kayole. So the way you call yourself a plumber, you can call yourself a doctor. So they will start with Kayole and then a name like Dr. So-and-so. So then I was like, okay. So the word Kayole originates from Uganda, meaning a heap of grass. So then that puts us into another question. How did the word end up coming to Kenya? And how did it end up being a name for this estate? Voila, here comes this really, really interesting book. So it's called The Comforts of Home, Prostitution in Colonial Nairobi by WWII. So it's a very, very interesting book about history of Nairobi, and it carries a lot about prostitution. So before jumping to this, during World War I, there was a very different type, before World War I, there's a very different type of prostitution in Nairobi. So you had women who used to sit in houses, and then men will come to those houses, and they wouldn't have the publicly displayed prostitution in that. So when the World War broke off, Nairobi was the center point for the King African Rifles. All the troops mobilized from different parts of Africa, Rhodesia, Uganda, would be stationed in Nairobi briefly before being dispatched into other areas. And when they reached Nairobi, they needed to be calmed down. Their testosterone needed to be managed. Otherwise, you'll end up with bar fights, thieving, so on and so forth. So there was a very huge influx of prostitutes in Nairobi specifically to service the soldiers of the King African Rifles. So then you had an influx from different parts of East Africa coming into Nairobi. And something very interesting here in this book. Page 71, it states that in 1923, almost 100 years ago, there was a census done on the prostitutes in Nairobi. And from sampling, I think this was called, it's currently Luthuli Avenue, but it's called, I think, Ribeiro Street. And it says there were a total of 213 prostitutes. And amongst them, 61 were Kikuyu, 58 Ugandan, 38 Nandi, 37 from Bukoba, 15 in Lamu, 12 Somali, and a lone one who was Swahili. So the Kikuyu is going to be understandable because they come from the area closer to Nairobi. But the second highest, which was almost close to the Kikuyu, were the Ugandans. So there was a very huge number of Ugandan prostitutes in Nairobi. And further in the book, so there are these three gentlemen, the three Ugandan men who lived in Nairobi. They call themselves the people of the representative of the people of the exterior dark. So they wrote 3 letters to a Mr. Dr. Patterson. He was the chief sanitation officer in Nairobi, and also sent a copy to the king of Baganda. And they describe the melodramatic form of what was called the Watembezi type of prostitution. So after the World War, or during the World War, because there was so much demand for prostitution, instead of sitting in the house and waiting for men to come to them, these prostitutes would go to the street. And that's the kind of prostitution you still see today. On Koinange Street, you see some of it in the estates and some of it in CBD and River Road. So if you don't know about Baganda people and Baganda men, they're very proud people. So I think they must have been astonished to see a lot of the Ugandan women who were selling themselves in the street of Nairobi. So in this letter sent to Dr. Patterson, and they talked about the horrible business happening there, and they claimed that these prostitutes hinder men from working because these men will now be seeking a lot of pleasure, and they become weak and unfit of any sort of work. So Dr. Patterson, being who he was, a Scottish guy in Kenya, and being in charge of the medical department was the only government body that was allowed to move people on sanitation grounds. And that part, prostitution was thought as being a sanitation issue because of the spread of venereal diseases and other things. And it happened in River Road, which happened to be very dirty. So they wrote this letter so that it can be moved on grounds of sanitation. So Dr. Patterson agreed to meet these 3 gentlemen. He undertook this survey, and together with the king of Buganda, agreed to deport the Ugandan women. But something happened. These Ugandan women had been in Kenya for 10, 15 years. A good number of them refused to go back. So that time, the Kenya-Uganda railway, they'll be put on the railway line, and then along the way, some of them will jump out, or when they get to Nakuru, they pretend they're going to toilet, then they go back. So where did they end up to? That's another hint from this book. In Nairobi used to end at Outer Ring Road. That's why it's called the Outer Ring Road. It's sort of the outermost part of Nairobi. Anywhere apart from that was now outside Nairobi. What is currently Umoja, Dandora, Buruburu, so on and so forth. These were large swaths of land, mostly they're owned by government, all these ranchers. So they ended up being squatters in this area. So they would go build mud houses and live there. And they provided another type of prostitution. So the Nairobi CBD prostitution was the highest paying because you had a lot of people there. Then you had the one in Pumwani and Majengo where women used to stay in the house. But then there were African men who were mostly poorer and didn't have money to pay the high rates there. So these African men ended up in now these areas to look for prostitution for these women who were now a little bit older and they lost their luster for that. So you had a lot of huts being set up in the current area of Dandora, Kayole, leading your way towards Embakasi. So these older women, a good number of them, were Ugandans. As we can see, the population census of prostitutes, a lot of them were Ugandans, and they couldn't go home, or they didn't want to go home for whatever reasons that were there. And they just took the prostitution outside of Nairobi. So during this time, there was not a lot of economic activities that used to happen there. So when the women were not prostituting, they would start to sell grass. So because it was very available, so they would cut this grass, bundle it together, and put it outside their houses as a means of supplementing their income. That's how then we ended up with Kayole, because now we really ask, where are you going? The only word that could say, like, I'm going to the place where they sell bundled grass. And at that time, because the Ugandan women are the majority there, they gave it the name, oh, Kayole. So they would say, I'm selling you Kayole. Kayole, 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 Kayole. So that's how we ended up with Kayole, the name. And by 1923, the area came up with the name Kayole, or stuck to the name Kayole, and every subsequent buyer, everything gets picked up the name. So that's it. Ugandan Prostitutes gave Kayole its name. Until next time, keep watching. Yani Buddha, after kuachiva always subscribe. Apa. But you just subscribe. Hey, and I have more videos here.